Human resources people of Reddit. What are some NSFW complaints you've had to investigate about your workers? I used to work in HR for a manufacturing company, and one day a guy came into the office, clearly upset, asking to be transferred out of his department. He said a supervisor was making him feel unsafe. Naturally, we needed details to start an investigation, so we asked him to explain who the individual was and what had happened. What he told us was shocking. He revealed that he and this supervisor had been having relations outside of work for several months. However, things had taken a dark turn when the supervisor tried to SA him. He showed us text messages they'd exchanged. The messages were relentless. His abuser, the supervisor, would text him both during work and off hours, saying things like how badly he wanted to sleep with him, demanding he show up at his house, and making other inappropriate comments. Oddly enough, while they were at work, the supervisor completely ignored him in person and acted like they were just two co-workers who never interacted. The evidence was undeniable, and when we confronted the supervisor, he admitted everything. He even begged us not to fire him, promising it would never happen again. But the situation was clear-cut, and we terminated him that same day. To ensure the victim felt safer, we transferred him to a different department, but unfortunately, he resigned a few weeks later. Story 2. A male manager came to me looking panicked and asked me to come with him. When I asked why, he said something like, "This girl isn't wearing a shirt." Well, not a real shirt. Naturally, I followed him to her area and found this female employee, who'd already caused a few issues, wearing just a black bra and a mesh top. It was essentially just mesh with some semi-translucent material barely holding it together. I had to take her off the floor, lead her to an office, and tell her she had to clock out, go home, change, and then come back. She wasn't happy, to say the least. I was called every name under the sun, and she demanded that I call the regional HR director. I did, and the director backed me up, telling her she needed to leave. She stormed out, shouting all the way. When she returned to work in business casual attire, we already had a write-up ready for her. Not long after, she was fired for having sleeping with two different men at the same time in a car in the company parking lot. A situation caught on camera. And get this, she was in her late 40s. I could tell you so many more stories about the chaos she caused during her time there. Story 3. I work in HR, and there are two incidents that I'll never forget. The first was with a man who repeatedly told his female coworker that he wanted to force her. Several male coworkers overheard these threats, but didn't report them because the man was a supervisor, and they feared for their jobs. The situation escalated when, after the woman went to the restroom, the supervisor was heard saying, "Don't think you can hide in the restroom. I'll just force you in there." One of the men finally blew the whistle. The police were called, the supervisor was fired, and he sat in HR crying, begging not to be fired because he had a wife and two kids. The second incident, which wasn't as severe, involved a young man who was upset about being passed over for a promotion. In frustration, he took a screwdriver and carved several dongs into the paint of the manager's brand new car. Of course, it was all caught on camera. Story 4. One of our executives experienced a mental health crisis while working abroad in a less developed country. After disappearing without a trace, concerns arose that he might have been taken hostage. To ensure his safety, we enlisted the help of a professional security service to locate and retrieve him. After an intensive 4-week search, he was found nearly 300 kilometers away from his original location. Shockingly, he had established a cult, declared himself the embodiment of the damned, and amassed almost 300 followers. The security team successfully extracted him, and he was admitted to a mental health facility for 3 months of treatment. While the situation might seem surreal, it took a deeply disturbing turn when it was revealed that he had self-castrated and encouraged at least 40 of his followers to do the same. Story 5. I'm an IT professional, but occasionally we'd assist HR with their investigations. About 15 years ago, I worked at a company where the employees were, let's just say, a bit wild. There were incidents like people banging in the lobby after hours, hookups in the bathrooms, and even someone flashing her boyfriend in his entire department. 2 cases, however, stand out in my memory for very different reasons. Someone reported to HR that a supervisor was abusing an employee he was dating, and it was happening at work. HR began monitoring the situation and asked me to review camera footage to verify the claims. I started checking footage around the times when their badge swipes indicated they were entering or leaving. After several hours of searching, I found something from the previous week. In the footage, they entered a back stairwell, and it escalated quickly. He put his hands on her, and when she tried to defend herself, he got physical with her. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I immediately downloaded the footage, rushed it to HR without causing a scene, and told them, Either she calls the cops or I do. The victim was one of the kindest, most genuine people I'd ever met, and seeing her treated like that was infuriating. HR, to their credit, acted swiftly and professionally. They presented the evidence to her, and with their support, she contacted the police. It turned out she had tried to leave him before, but he wouldn't let her, and when she called the police in the past, they sided with him. This time, the footage made all the difference. He was arrested, and she finally got the justice she deserved. Another case involved an employee who was notorious for poor performance, but her manager didn't have enough to fire her, yet. One payday Friday, she called in sick but showed up later to collect her paycheck. HR noticed she was visibly intoxicated and called the police. HR then pulled me into an emergency meeting, mostly so I could monitor the cameras and document what happened. The receptionist did an incredible job stalling the woman to give the cops time to arrive. Meanwhile, the woman could barely walk straight, reeked of alcohol, and looked like she'd already had more than a few drinks. As she headed back to her car, the police showed up and stopped her. Things escalated fast. She decided to fight the female officer who was trying to search her. Big mistake. The cop delivered a swift takedown, straight up UFC style, slamming her onto the hood of the car after she tried to throw a punch. It was glorious, honestly. If that wasn't enough, we also caught her on camera urinating in the downstairs entrance while waiting for the elevator. Needless to say, HR finally had enough evidence to fire her. Story 6. I worked as an investigator for a major bank, primarily uncovering fake accounts, embezzlement, and similar schemes. One case, however, really stuck with me. I caught an employee opening fake accounts, but his explanation turned out to be far more complicated and disturbing than I expected. He claimed his boss had coerced him into opening the fake accounts. The boss had allegedly forced him into inappropriate acts and threatened to oust him as gay to their small, conservative rural town if he didn't comply. As a contract attorney conducting investigations for the bank, I technically held the title of investigator, but we were required to disclose our status as attorneys during interviews, even though we weren't acting as legal counsel for the bank. When he asked me for legal advice on what he should do, it was gut-wrenching. I knew he was likely a victim of SA, possibly a forced act, and yet, because of my role, I couldn't give him guidance on how to report it or protect himself. In the end, both the manager and the employee were fired. The manager for misconduct and the employee for the fraudulent accounts. The whole situation felt deeply unjust. This man not only lost his job, but also carried the weight of what had likely been severe abuse. I left that job shortly after. That case, and my inability to truly help him, was one of the main reasons. Story 7. I'm a manager, and here's a summary of an incident I dealt with. One of the women on my dock claimed that a male coworker had put his hands on her and essayed her both at work and outside of work. Per company policy, if allegations extend outside of the workplace, I'm required to review any messages exchanged between the two parties. When I asked her to provide them, she declined. That raised some suspicions. The accused coworker, however, willingly shared their text messages. The messages painted a different picture. She was clearly the aggressor, while he seemed neutral and unengaged. I also reviewed the security footage for the time she claimed the harassment occurred. The cameras showed them talking briefly before heading to different parts of the dock. I went further, reviewing footage over the next several days on fast forward, and saw nothing beyond casual conversation. Based on the evidence, it became clear that her claims were likely untrue or that anything inappropriate had occurred outside of work in a manner not documented through text or footage. After presenting my findings, I learned that this was the third time she had made similar accusations, and in each previous case, there wasn't enough evidence to substantiate her claims. My personal takeaway? It seemed possible that she fabricated these allegations when men either rejected her advances or only wanted casual arrangements. But I can't say for certain. The most the company could do was transfer her to a different location. Story 8. At my company, we have a reporting system where people can call in anonymous tips. When I was promoted to HR, I took on the responsibility of investigating these reports. At the time, I was a 22-year-old recent college graduate, and my first case involved an employee allegedly screwing with another employee in the back of a semi. This was quite the introduction to my new role. I ended up interviewing several people, including the accused, a 30-year-old woman, about what became known as the slob on the knob incident. The investigation took some unexpected turns. It turned out that she was married and had indeed performed the act on a coworker. But that wasn't the end of the story. I uncovered more details. She had recently received breast implants, which were funded by a manager in the building, with whom she was also having an affair. This manager had been sent to work at this branch, located 2 hours from his home, after facing issues at the company. He stayed in a hotel just 500 feet from the office. During lunch breaks, he and the woman would disappear, and in exchange, she got her implants. The company was unionized, so in the end, both employees were fired, but they were able to get their jobs back through the union grievance process. A few months later, the woman filed for divorce. A bit further down the line, she ended up marrying the co-worker involved in the original incident. However, the situation took a tragic turn. Despite the confidentiality of the investigation, it was a small, rural building where gossip spread quickly. The details of the affair were known to many, which led to her receiving a lot of harassment. She was blamed for getting a well-liked manager fired and was subjected to derogatory comments. Tragically, about a year after their marriage, she offed herself due to the ongoing harassment. It wasn't until years later that the full extent of the harassment came to light, as she had never reported it. It was a sad situation for everyone involved. Story 9. I'm not in HR, but I work as an employment attorney who gets called in by HR or for E&O claims. Back in the early 2000s, we had an E&O case involving a woman who claimed her supervisor had been making lewd comments. She alleged he expressed a desire to dress up in lingerie and using a ping-pong paddle during their private time. According to her, he had also booked a work event, and while driving her there, he pulled over to reveal he was wearing stockings and garters, pulling out the paddle. The employee eventually quit and filed a labor board claim for a hostile work environment and constructive discharge. The manager denied everything, insisting he was happily married, that the employee was making things up, and that she had created a bizarre story to try to get money. When the employee filed her notice of claim, we got the initial disclosures for the labor board hearing. It turns out the manager believed that once AIM messages were deleted, they were gone for good. But that wasn't the case. We found pages of AIM messages sent during work hours where he was asking to be reamed out by a ping-pong paddle while wearing stockings. We ended up settling the case. Story 10. I wasn't in HR, but I ended up involved in this situation simply because of my proximity to what happened. In my industry, it's common to bring on a lot of summer interns to handle the extra workload, especially in the warehouse and field operations. One summer, we hired an intern who quickly became known as the weird guy. He had an odd personality, liked to talk about strange topics, and generally made people uncomfortable. Still, he seemed mostly harmless, so everyone just dealt with it. Our warehouse has a room with a locking door and a washing machine inside. One day, a manager noticed that the intern had been missing for a while, so he went to look for him. After a brief search, he saw the door to that room was closed and locked. He knocked, waited, and knocked again. Eventually, he heard shuffling from the other side. The manager told whoever was inside to open up now, suspecting that the intern might be using drugs or something. When the door finally opened, the intern came out, and the manager asked what he'd been doing. The intern's first response? Nothing. The manager wasn't buying it and kept pressing him. Finally, the intern blurted out, yanking on it. The manager, still confused, didn't understand what he meant and kept asking. Frustrated, the intern clarified. What? You don't do that? That's when it dawned on the manager that the guy was serious. He had been doing solo in the locked room. The manager, dumbfounded, told the intern, "We're going down to HR, and you're going to explain this?" At this point, the intern panicked and completely melted down, refusing to go. So, the manager went to HR himself and reported the situation. When he explained what happened, the HR rep had no idea what yanking it meant, so the manager had to awkwardly clarify that the intern had been rubbing the meat. The HR rep immediately burst out laughing and had to compose herself before confronting the intern. By the time she was ready, the intern had already left the building and never came back. Later, we found the notebook he always carried around. Every single page was filled with hand-drawn porno scenes. To this day, we have no idea how long this behavior had been going on, how many times it happened, or where else it might have occurred. I jokingly recommended they burn the building down and start over. Sadly, my advice wasn't taken. Story 11. In my 30-year career, I've witnessed more than my fair share of odd and inappropriate situations. We had an incident with rubber left on a desk, two married salespeople who spent the whole day hooking up rather than actually working. They were eventually fired for poor sales, and that's when the truth came out. There was a manager who was let go for repeatedly making inappropriate comments about fake dongs to younger female employees. One employee had gay corn on his computer but swore he was straight, and another manager accidentally projected his screen during a meeting, revealing a whole history of explicit content. Then there was the HR manager who hooked up with another manager at a company party, only for her to later file a complaint about the encounter. Both were ultimately fired as well. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. One more incident I remember was when an employee got into trouble for commenting on the attire of a young female summer intern, pointing out that her outfit was highly inappropriate. Unfortunately, the intern was the CEO's granddaughter, and she wore outfits that could hardly be described as professional. This all happened in what was supposed to be a professional industry, which made it even more shocking. Story 12. I'm in IT, not HR, but I had an interesting story I shared recently that goes like this. We had a break-in, and since the new security system wouldn't be installed for a week, we hired an off-duty cop to keep an eye on the place at night. The next day, my boss, who's a bit of a nosy one, wanted to know what the cop had been doing on the computer all night, so I checked his internet history. It took me a while to piece it together because there were two windows open at the same time, but eventually, I figured it out. One window, as you might expect, was full of unclothed ladies. The other? Well, it was a collection of bodies, mostly rotting. Needless to say, he wasn't asked to come back. Story 13. A guy was being investigated for harassing a female colleague. What started as one complaint quickly snowballed into allegations from about 5 other women. He'd make comments like, "You look great today," or "Your ass looks amazing," and would constantly pester them to go on dates with him, even telling one to drop your boyfriend, and I'll show you what a real man can do. He denied all of it, claiming it was actually the women who were harassing him. He insisted he had text messages that proved he was the victim, but when asked to provide them, he said he deleted them. To make matters more interesting, he also claimed to have a witness who would clear his name. This witness was a middle-aged woman, and while she denied ever overhearing the women planning to get him fired, she did admit that he'd made similar comments to her. However, she said it didn't bother her because she was married and had no interest in him. As part of the investigation, we also had to look into a couple of incidents involving unsolicited explicit pictures. One was from a male employee to another male, and the other was male to female. And yes, as part of my role in the investigation, I saw the pictures as well. Story 14. Not HR, but I was a retail store manager, so I handled plenty of HR-related situations. Most of my employees were women, as were most of our customers. Naturally, the women's bathroom got most of the attention. That said, the men's room could be a nightmare when the rare male customer showed up. One day, we got a complaint about a smell coming from the bathrooms. As the manager, I had a rule. I wouldn't ask my employees to do anything I wouldn't do myself, especially since I earned a lot more than they did. So, I grabbed a pair of latex gloves and headed to investigate. I started with the men's room. Surprisingly, it was fine. Just a scrap or two of toilet paper, nothing major. Feeling relieved, I moved on to the women's room. The moment I cracked the door, I was hit by the most putrid stench imaginable. It was overwhelming, like the smell of rot. When I opened the door fully, I was absolutely floored. The ceiling, walls, and floor were smeared with feces, like a scene straight out of a horror movie. There were finger streaks everywhere, as if someone had deliberately painted the walls with it. I stood there in shock, trying to process what I was looking at. I quickly closed the door, taped it off, and called my boss to let him know I was bringing in a professional cleanup crew. He insisted I handle it myself. I flat out told him he was out of his mind. If he'd seen what I had, he'd think twice. Eventually, he relented. About 10 days later, it happened again. This time, the only women who had access were my employees. It didn't take much to figure out who the culprit was. One was a clean freak and a germaphobe, definitely not the type to cause this. The other, Maria, had been acting strangely. She smelled awful, kept avoiding eye contact, and had washed her hands at least 5 times that day. I pulled her aside. "Maria, what the hell is going on?" She hesitated before blurting out, "Sometimes I smoke a little something, and then I hear bugs in the toilet. I have to get them out before they drown." I was stunned. I told her, "Okay, here's what's going to happen. I'm going to find a pin I don't care about, and you're going to write everything you just told me, every detail and how many times you've done this. Then we'll figure out where to go from here." While she wrote her statement, I called my boss. "Hey, so there's an issue with Maria." He gave me some corporate spiel. "There aren't problems, just opportunities." "All right," I said. "Well, Maria has an opportunity to stop doing drugs and smearing shit on the walls because she thinks there are bugs in the toilet." Maria was fired, obviously, but I made sure she stayed on staff long enough to get her into rehab. It was one of the wildest things I've ever dealt with. Story 15. I once got a call from a client asking if we'd watched the news that day. We hadn't, so we started checking the website of the local news station to see what was going on. That's when we saw it, clear as day, my coworker's mugshot staring back at us. It turned out he'd been arrested for possession of over 500,000 inappropriate kitty images. The news hit us like a ton of bricks. None of us had seen it coming, and we couldn't believe someone we worked alongside every day was capable of something so horrifying. The guy ended up being sentenced to 5 years behind bars, but the aftermath didn't end there. Since he'd had access to our systems, I spent the next few months combing through servers, meticulously checking for any evidence that he might have used them as additional storage for his stash. Story 16. Around 2008, our IT director came into my office and said, "You need to see this." He had discovered something through our internet surveillance software that left us both stunned. Turns out, a guy in accounting had installed a program on his work computer to make it look like he was browsing Yahoo, but in reality, he was surfing porn. Not just casually either. He'd saved thousands of images in a hidden folder on his computer. It was an open and shut case. Looking back, it also explained why he was notorious for taking such long bathroom breaks. When we confronted him, the color drained from his face, and he looked like he was about to pass out. As I was escorting him out of the building, he turned to me and nervously asked, "Are you going to tell my fiancée?" I just shook my head and said, "No, that's not my business." But what I didn't tell him was that I'd be sharing the story on Reddit in 2024. Story 17. I was the manager at the time, and one of my employees came to me with a strange complaint. She kept finding rubbers in her office trash can. This wasn't a one-off thing. It happened often enough to raise serious concerns. After the third or fourth incident, we decided to install a camera in the hallway outside her office to figure out what was going on. What we discovered was shocking. It turned out the culprit was her. She stayed up late after hours and, as we later found out, and was meeting with different guys. The situation escalated when a coworker, who happened to know her husband, stumbled upon one of the used rubbers. Panicking, she made up an elaborate story about people breaking into her office after hours and doing things on her desk. Once confronted with the footage, she finally admitted the truth. She confessed to staying late and being with at least 3 different guys that we knew of. Needless to say, it was one of the most awkward and bizarre situations I've ever had to deal with as a manager. Story 18. At my old job, part of the security team's responsibility was to check that all the offices were locked at the end of the day. Because of this, they occasionally walked in on people, well, doing things they shouldn't have been doing in the offices. The most memorable incident involved a manager and an engineer from a completely different department. While you might argue it wasn't the worst situation, at least he wasn't involved with someone under his direct supervision. There was one glaring problem. The manager in question was the head of HR. As you can imagine, that didn't go over well. Needless to say, he was no longer employed with the company after that incident. Story 19. A friend of mine, an engineer, had been using ChatGPT to assist with his work, writing emails, creating Excel formulas, and even developing macros. The only issue was that he signed in with his personal email account, which also contained logs of some rather private and creative writing exercises he had ChatGPT help him with in his free time. This all came to light during a Zoom call where he was sharing his desktop while presenting a report. As he cycled between tabs, an eagle-eyed viewer noticed the ChatGPT sidebar and managed to snag a screenshot. The logs in the sidebar included entries like how to reference adjacent cells in data validation, automatically outputting spreadsheet data into a formatted email, the sexy island adventures of Dread Pirate Booty Beer, importing generated MD5 file hashes into a cell. Naturally, IT got involved. They reviewed his computer and the ChatGPT logs and discovered that he'd been writing erotica in his free time. While the content wasn't anything too outrageous, the logs revealed that 80% of the conversations involved him repeatedly trying to bypass ChatGPT's content filters and persuading it to stop using clinical terms like female genitalia when he wanted his writing to sound less professional. This led to an awkward meeting with HR, where he was told in no uncertain terms that his personal projects should never cross into company territory. He was also required to create a new email account specifically for work-related ChatGPT use. Here's where things got complicated. He was paying for a premium subscription on his personal account, so he had to decide, premium ChatGPT for his career or premium ChatGPT for his smut. He chose smut. Honestly, I don't blame him. If he's paying for it out of his own pocket, why not use it for personal enjoyment? And if the company notices a dip in his work quality because he has to use an older ChatGPT model, well, that's on them. They're the ones who mandated the change. They can pay for a premium subscription if it matters that much to them. Story 20. About 10 years ago, I had to self-report to HR. I'm in IT, and we were dealing with a live issue where the email system was stalling whenever it tried to process file attachments. There were 5 of us on a call, and I was sharing my screen as we worked to investigate the problem. While going through the attachments, I randomly opened one, and bam! There was a photo of Becky from payroll, fully exposed. I quickly closed the image. The call went silent for a bit, but nobody said anything. We eventually figured out the email issue and wrapped up the call. I couldn't risk one of the others from the call beating me to HR, so I immediately walked down the corridor, past payroll, and headed straight to the HR manager's office. A few weeks later, it was announced that Becky would be leaving the company for a new job. Story 21. I wasn't directly in HR, but I worked in a hospital setting and heard about this incident from HR. The hospital where I worked used generic ID cards that only listed your name, with no indication of your job title. One day, a housekeeper, basically a janitor, decided to get creative. He bought a white doctor's coat, stitched his name onto it, and started walking around like he was a doctor. His plan was to pass himself off as medical staff. Thankfully, he never attempted to provide patient care. His only goal seemed to be hitting on nurses. From what I heard, he was actually pretty successful. He managed to charm a few of them, even though they didn't know he wasn't actually a doctor. He got caught only because a nurse he had been involved with saw him flirting with another nurse. Feeling hurt and betrayed, she retaliated by filing a SA complaint. That's when HR finally got involved and started putting everything together. It wasn't long before they realized there was no Dr. John Smith, just a housekeeper named John Smith who had managed to fool people with a coat and a little confidence. Story 22. I've got 3 good stories, all from when I worked in a grocery store setting. The store had a public bathroom downstairs, and let me tell you, it was always a mess. It was located in a rough part of town, so addicts would shoot up in there and leave the place completely destroyed. Feces all over the floor, piss on the walls, you name it. It was pretty much unusable. There were employee bathrooms upstairs, but one of the workers didn't want to make the trek up. Instead, he'd sneak into the coolers and piss in the drain. One day, a young girl, probably 18 or 19, was in the cooler, and he didn't realize she was there. She saw him drop his pants to his ankles and piss down the drain. Needless to say, he was let go pretty quickly after that incident. Another employee, who was a known drunk, had a disturbing habit of boasting about how he would get drunk and harm his wife because she would talk back to him. Eventually, he started complaining about how she wouldn't sleep with him anymore. One of our other employees, who was very openly gay, had had enough and told him, "Me and you can go back into the cooler right now, and I'll blow you off." He continued to offer favors throughout the week. This was brought to HR, and there were 6 witness statements to back it up, so we all thought for sure he was getting fired. But somehow he wasn't. Then there were 2 overnight employees, a janitor and an overnight stalker, who had been working there for over 20 years. They were great at their jobs, and nobody ever had any complaints about them. That is, until several lockers were reported as broken into. They pulled the security footage from the break room, and when they reviewed it, they were shocked to find that these 2 employees had been banging in the break room for hours every time they worked together. Our footage only went back a week, so we had no idea how long this had been going on. But even with their extended breaks, they still managed to get all their assigned work done in half the shift. It was definitely an interesting place to work. Story 23. I wasn't in HR, but I had to report a guy to HR for something pretty gross. This guy, a full-grown adult man, would pretend to wash his hands. If he thought nobody was in the bathroom, he'd walk in, turn the faucet on, walk over to the urinal while the water ran, then walk back to turn it off. He'd grab a dry paper towel, wipe his hands with it, and then leave without ever actually washing them. Some people might think I shouldn't care, but his job was to handle and package hundreds of medical devices that would be sent to compromised individuals. I couldn't just ignore the fact that he wasn't practicing basic hygiene. I ended up leaving the job shortly after that, but a few old co-workers told me that he got fired for a bunch of other things. But the hand-washing issue was definitely called out and supported by others who had reported him as well. It was pretty unsettling knowing he was handling such critical equipment while ignoring basic cleanliness. Story 24. We recently had to fire 2 employees. The male was a supervisor in his late 50s, and he had a much younger female employee working for him, probably in her mid to late 20s. She was terrible at her job, especially since we work in the oil field, and she knew next to nothing about it. Over time, we started noticing that he was spending more and more time out on location doing her job, while she seemed to be doing who knows what. HR started getting suspicious when confidential information started coming to light. We worked 24/7 with callouts, so we noticed that whenever she was called out in the middle of the night, he'd meet her at the location. We could track this because all of our trucks have GPS monitoring. The interesting part was that whenever he got to the location, his GPS would malfunction, he'd unplug it, and then it would turn back on hours later. After some digging, We found out that they'd been making fake callouts and meeting up at company locations and in company vehicles to bang while still being paid for it. It was a pretty clear violation, and once HR got all the evidence, they were both fired. Story 25. I was working as an office temp back in 1996, still getting the hang of office culture. One afternoon, I happened to walk past a cubicle belonging to a guy who was known for his difficult attitude and frequent complaints. As I passed by, I couldn't help but notice he was downloading a rather explicit image of a woman doing solo. It caught me off guard, but I didn't say anything and just kept walking. The next day, a company-wide memo went out that, quite possibly for the first time, reminded everyone that internet access was strictly for work-related tasks. It seemed like they were finally taking the issue seriously. Then, the very next day, something even stranger happened. I went to the office supply area to grab some materials and noticed an open pack of 1.4 megabytes floppy disks. Usually, there were about 100 disks in a pack, but now there were only 5 left. It struck me as odd. The disks had clearly been in heavy use, and I couldn't help but wonder where they had gone. The mystery of the missing floppy disks added a strange layer to the whole situation, but I guess at that point, it was clear to everyone what had been happening behind the scenes. Story 26. A warehouse worker came to me with a complaint about an older female colleague who had been making him uncomfortable by pinching his bum and making inappropriate comments toward him. He explained that it had been happening for quite some time, and it was starting to affect his ability to focus on work. When I brought the issue up with the woman in question, she tried to downplay it, suggesting that he was just overreacting and that the complaint was frivolous. She even tried to make light of the situation, implying it wasn't a big deal. Despite her dismissal of the matter, the worker was clearly upset and felt disrespected. I ended up leaving the company before the situation was fully resolved, but the tension around it lingered, and it seemed like the issue was never properly addressed. Story 27. I wasn't in HR, but I really need to get this off my chest. I was working in Germany on an IT green card, and there was this guy who worked alongside me. He used to go on and on about being from Pakistan, but adamantly insisted he was not Pakistani. He made it a point to tell us every single day, even though he was Indian and had been raised in Pakistan. But, according to him, he was not Pakistani. Honestly, no one really cared, but he kept repeating it, like it was some badge of honor. The guy had some odd habits too. Every day, without fail, he would pour powdered tang, yes, the orange drink, onto a plate and eat it with a spoon. Every single day. And then, he'd crank up Britney Spears songs on his desk speakers and belt out the lyrics with this ridiculously high-pitched voice. His sense of fashion was interesting. While the rest of us were rocking khakis, jeans, or casual wear, he showed up every day in a 3-piece suit. Always. And don't even get me started on his head. It was shaped like a volleyball, and to top it off, he seemed to have no neck. It was almost like his head was just placed directly on his shoulders. One day, he made it clear that he had been stalking me. He lived on the west side, but one weekend he casually mentioned that I, being from the east side, could find better places to eat. Then it came out that he had been taking the U-Bahn to my neighborhood on weekends, apparently just to follow me around. Then came the day when he showed up at work with black sesame seeds. I think they were Nigella seeds. He told me they were a gift from his mother, and that they were meant to promote fertility. His words? That I needed to bear a child. The HR woman was completely baffled. I don't think she knew how to process all of this. Story 28. I've worked at reception at a few places, and there's always been some extra administrative work, especially at smaller organizations. At one of these smaller workplaces, I reported directly to the VP, which meant I handled a lot of the general inquiries and external communications. One morning, I opened the general inquiries inbox to find an email accusing one of our new employees of being an offender. It was shocking. We had conducted background checks before hiring them, and nothing had come up. However, not all offenses are reported to the police, and some records can be sealed if they happen during someone's minor years, so it wasn't impossible for something to slip through. The email included detailed allegations, specific locations, dates, and claims that suggested the sender knew the employee personally. HR immediately placed the employee on paid leave while they investigated. Background checks were redone, and the sender of the email was contacted by phone for clarification and additional information. This kicked off an intense and resource-heavy investigation. HR began reaching out to the people and organizations mentioned in the email, potential witnesses, former workplaces, and schools. Department heads and managers were pulled away from their usual responsibilities to assist. Thousands of dollars in wages and countless work hours were spent trying to uncover the truth. It was chaotic and disruptive for the entire business. In the end, it turned out the allegations were completely false. None of the witnesses provided by the accuser corroborated the claims, and no evidence of wrongdoing was found. Through the course of the investigation, additional information about the accuser came to light, raising serious questions about their credibility. It even became apparent that the accuser had been stalking the employee, tracking them so closely that they managed to contact us just weeks after the employee started working here. Unfortunately, we couldn't run a background check on the accuser, so we'll never know the full extent of their history. But the situation highlighted how one person's malicious intent can snowball into a massive ordeal, costing a business significant time and money. This was, without a doubt, the most dramatic HR scandal I've ever witnessed. A bitter individual from the past nearly derailed an employee's life, but in the end, the truth prevailed, and the allegations were proven unfounded. Some details have been adjusted to protect confidentiality, but the core of the story, offender accusations, extensive investigations, and the eventual vindication of the accused, is entirely true. Story 29. A while ago, we received a complaint from a female senior manager claiming that women weren't given the opportunity to grow within the company in manufacturing. This was from one of the largest consumer packaged goods companies in the world, which had quarterly ethics training, diversity statements, and all the expected corporate initiatives. The complaint came from a senior manager who, on closer inspection, had a pretty fast-growing career. She was promoted every year and had the company fund 2 master's degrees over the span of 10 years. Given her career trajectory, the complaint seemed unusual, so we decided to look deeper into the situation. It turned out that she had been having an affair with the married plant director. Initially, he was her boss's boss, and later, he became her direct supervisor. This affair had been ongoing for years and appeared to be the reason behind her rapid career progression, as her AP approval process was essentially overseen by him. She made the complaint because she wanted to be reassigned to a different department after breaking off the affair, but the plant director was persistent in trying to continue it. Both employees were ultimately fired, as company policy strictly forbids relationships with direct or indirect reports. Story 30. I have an experience that directly accuses me, falsely, of course, but still. At the time, I was 19 and working at a grocery store known for its healthy food and organics. I had just moved in with my boyfriend, now husband, and I worked in the deli department. My shift started early, so I'd get there before the store opened, with about an hour of time to myself to prep food, label products, restock, etc. About an hour before the store opened, the juicer would arrive to make fresh juices, and we had 2 people who alternated shifts. One of them was a woman who had a past with drug addiction and was dating the manager of the meat department. The other was a guy who always reminded me of Frodo from Lord of the Rings, but much shorter than me. I'm 5 feet 3 inches. He was nice enough, and we'd occasionally chat while working. From what I gathered, he had a wife who was pregnant with twins and another baby at home. She'd come in a few times, and she always seemed so sweet. This went on for almost a year. We'd just work and occasionally chat before the store opened. I had a habit of stepping out for a cigarette break in the designated area behind the store near the dumpsters, where there was a camera facing everything. The male juicer sometimes joined me for a cigarette, and we'd exchange small talk before heading back inside. One day, I came into a strange energy. Usually, when the female juicer was around, there was tension, but this felt different. She was completely silent, giving me disgusted looks here and there. She was a high-conflict person who liked to gossip about others, so I just kept to myself. The next day, my buddy from Produce was acting a bit strange too, almost flirty, which was odd because he knew I was serious with my boyfriend. I brushed it off, but then, as I went out for my cigarette break, the male juicer dropped what he was doing and followed me. He tapped me on the arm, asking for a cigarette, which was normal. We exchanged small talk like usual, and I noticed when we went back in, my buddy from Produce gave the juicer a thumbs up and snickered with him. I was a little confused, but it didn't seem like a big deal. The next day, I was called into the office. This was odd since I had always been a hard worker and had never been called in unless it was for something official. I walked in and saw my manager, the district manager, and a man I didn't recognize. I thought maybe they were promoting me to management, since I had been training for it and already doing the work without the pay. But no, the man started the conversation with, "We have an expectation for our employees," and I was immediately confused. Then, they played a video about inappropriate conduct between employees. I was completely lost, and after it ended, I asked, "What does this have to do with me? Why am I here?" The district manager scoffed and said, "We heard the rumors, Kat." I was taken aback, asking, "What rumors?" Then she said, "We heard about you and the male juicer." Apparently, he had been telling people I was doing more than just smoking cigarettes with him in the mornings. The rumors said I was engaging in inappropriate acts instead. I was disgusted and denied everything. But the managers didn't believe me. So I asked, "There's a camera there. Can't you check the footage?" They all went silent, exchanging looks, before sending me back to work. They never admitted they were wrong. The rumors continued for months, and no one ever addressed the male juicer's actions. He never got in trouble, and I never received an apology. Afterward, I waited until he was done with his smoke break before taking mine. I eventually left the store when I became pregnant, something my boyfriend and I had been trying for, because I had hyperemesis gravidarum, HG, and was passing out from low blood pressure and vomiting on shifts. Despite my condition, the store refused to accommodate me with a simple stool to sit on while prepping food, even though the store wasn't open yet. They treated me terribly because my health affected my work, even with medication. The whole experience left me feeling completely unsupported. Story 31. Not HR, but I later learned all the details. When I was 22, I got hired into an exciting position with a national company, although our local office was small. Most of my coworkers were young, college-aged women, and the majority were black. Our area manager was a middle-aged black man, which is important to the story. Part of my training involved traveling with this manager in a work van, visiting 51 host locations across 3 states. It was hours of driving together, and he made a few offhand comments under his breath. I didn't catch all of them, but when I'd ask him to clarify, he'd backpedal. One I remember was when I grabbed a piece of candy from the office, and he chuckled, saying, "Oh, you like chocolate, huh?" It was odd, but I brushed it off at the time because he was generally well-liked, and I was young and naive. One of his assistant managers was a white woman around my age who was a mess. She often came into the office in revealing tank tops and would talk about how hungover she was, which was unprofessional. She worked closely with the manager, but their being alone in the office together all the time was considered normal. About a week after I started, the manager disappeared. The office was suddenly run by a bunch of college kids, all of whom were great, but totally taken advantage of by the company. That assistant manager also stopped showing up, and one day while I was in the office, some police officers arrived asking about the manager. None of us had any idea where he was, so they left without answers. A higher-up from the Southeast District came in and told me only that the manager was gone and no one was allowed in his workspace for a while. I had to find out later that the manager had been having an affair with the assistant manager. When she tried to end it, he stalked her, and she had to file for a restraining order. The affair was discovered by his girlfriend, who was heavily pregnant with their 3rd child at the time. Afterward, the manager fled the state, but not before he allegedly defiled his workspace after hours. I'm assuming he left bodily fluids in there. Once I pieced everything together, I realized that the manager had likely hired me for this close role because I was a young, white woman, which seemed to align with his preferences for cheating on his girlfriend. The other assistant manager ended up doing his job for months, believing she'd eventually get promoted, but the higher-ups kept leading her on without offering anything. Then, they hired someone else to fill the position, someone with no industry experience who never wore a belt. Every time he bent over, his entire backside was visible, which was awkward for everyone. I ended up calling HR to report it. After that, he started asking around to figure out who had called. He also installed cameras in the warehouse without informing anyone. The only sign was a piece of printer paper taped up on a wall that said the premises were now being recorded. He also had this weird habit of reading over my shoulder at my desk, so close that I eventually had to lean a full 90 degrees away from my chair. When I reacted, he was surprised and asked, "Do you not like people reading over your shoulder?" I told him no one does. He was in his late 30s and still referred to his mom as mommy, which was just one of many things that irked me about him. Not long after, the bigwig from the Southeast District disappeared too. She and her daughter, another high-ranking person, were found to be embezzling from the company. Story 32. I was the go-to IT guy HR would call whenever something internet-related and NSFW popped up. It seemed like there were always people doing some pretty dumb things on the company network, downloading corn, browsing inappropriate websites, and everything in between. Corn downloads were the most common issue, but there was one particular situation where I ended up saving someone's job. Here's how it worked. When employees clicked on corn ads, they often showed up in the logs in a way that made it seem like they had visited an inappropriate site, but only for a few seconds before they clicked onto something else. It was a subtle issue that could easily be misunderstood if HR wasn't trained to recognize it. So, I took the time to walk HR through the ins and outs of their internet reporting software, teaching them how to identify the difference between someone actually visiting a site and just accidentally triggering an ad. Because of that training, HR was able to spot the difference between real offenders and people who just got caught up with an ad for a second. In one case, this helped clear up a situation where someone was mistakenly thought to be looking at explicit content on purpose. Instead, it was just a quick ad click that was misinterpreted. Thanks to my training, the person involved was able to keep their job, and it saved everyone from making a hasty decision. It felt good knowing I'd stepped in to prevent an unfair outcome. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update.